The story begins in the quiet stillness of a northern Italian convent in 2015, a place that, to the outside world, radiates devotion, serenity, and centuries-old tradition. At first glance, the convent seems untouched by time: ivy-clad stone walls, candlelit corridors, the faint scent of incense lingering in the air, and the low murmur of prayer echoing through vaulted halls. Yet beneath this serene exterior, a hidden darkness had festered for years, unseen and unspoken. It begins with the janitor, a middle-aged man with decades of service to the church, who notices something amiss while performing his nightly rounds. The smell strikes him first, a putrid, almost metallic odor that seems out of place among the familiar scents of wax and aged wood. The narrative plunges immediately into suspense, immersing the audience in the sensory horror of the moment. As he cautiously investigates the East Wing, a section of the convent largely unused and forgotten, he discovers the unimaginable. Behind the locked door, concealed beneath layers of dust, old linens, and religious paraphernalia, lies a secret that will shock the Vatican, a hidden body, decayed and long concealed. The initial discovery is described with meticulous attention to detail, emphasizing the sensory impressions, the smell, the sight, the oppressive silence, the feeling of history pressing down on the intruder. This moment acts as the story's first emotional hook, immediately engaging the audience by highlighting the clash between apparent sanctity and hidden horror. The narrative then shifts to the immediate human reactions within the convent. Panic, disbelief, and an instinctive drive to cover up the discovery ripple through the small, cloistered community. Senior nuns confront the janitor, oscillating between denial and fear, while others are paralyzed by the realization that their institution's reputation and their own spiritual lives could be irreversibly damaged. The audience is drawn into the complex interplay of secrecy, fear, and devotion, understanding that the discovery is not only a physical horror but also a profound moral and spiritual crisis. Historical context is interwoven to heighten suspense and deepen understanding. The convent, founded in the late 19th century, had long been revered for its pious mission, charitable work, and strict observance of religious rules. Its isolation, both physical and social, created an environment where secrets could easily take root. The section explores the psychological and social structures that allowed the hidden body to remain undisturbed for 5 years, examining the hierarchy, obedience, and rigid discipline that define cloistered religious life. These details frame the eventual scandal, illustrating how an environment built on faith and trust could simultaneously harbor deception and concealment. Early responses from local clergy and church officials are portrayed in careful narrative detail. The story examines how information travels through hierarchical structures, whispered phone calls, discreet visits, and careful meetings behind closed doors. Fear of scandal, concern for institutional reputation, and the instinct to preserve both faith and authority influence every decision. This analysis provides insight into the mechanisms of denial and suppression that sustain secrecy, allowing the audience to understand why such a grave transgression could persist for so long without exposure. The narrative also captures the tension between human curiosity and obedience. Lay workers, neighboring residents, and even some younger nuns experience subtle hints of abnormality, unexplained absences, odd behavior, and strange rituals, but hesitate to act, fearing spiritual or social repercussions. The story emphasizes the slow build of suspicion, illustrating how small anomalies accumulate, creating a sense of unease that the audience feels viscerally. Psychological tension is heightened by contrasting the serene exterior of the convent with the underlying corruption, presenting the audience with a layered, slow-burning suspense. Personal testimonies and reconstructed dialogue bring the story to life. The janitor's perspective is central, his fear, revulsion, and moral dilemma are explored in detail, providing a human anchor for the unfolding events. Conversations between senior nuns, filled with tension, threats, and pleading, reveal the psychological mechanisms of secrecy, coercion, and rationalization. The narrative highlights how ordinary human emotions, fear, guilt, loyalty, intersect with institutional power to maintain silence, drawing the audience into the complex ethical landscape of the convent. The section delves further into the historical, spiritual, and psychological layers of the scandal. The convent's religious practices, its daily rituals, and the strict codes of conduct are depicted in vivid detail, showing how structured devotion can paradoxically foster both purity and concealment. The narrative contrasts the beauty of sacred rituals, chanting, prayers, and community service, with the grotesque reality of hidden death, creating a tension between external piety and internal moral decay. This contrast underscores the central theme, that appearances, no matter how holy, can mask profound darkness. Finally, the section broadens to consider the global implications. The discovery threatens to shatter not only local trust but also the credibility of the Vatican itself. The narrative foreshadows the coming investigations, confessions, and public scrutiny, building anticipation for subsequent sections. Through detailed exposition, the audience is prepared for the long, slow unraveling of secrecy, understanding the stakes both for individuals and for institutions. The first section ends with a lingering sense of unease, leaving viewers emotionally primed for the unfolding drama. The cold open thus combines immersive description, psychological insight, and moral tension, establishing the tone for a narrative that will explore devotion, secrecy, and human fallibility. The narrative now shifts to establish the deep historical and spiritual context necessary to understand the depth of the nuns' silent pact. We delve into Crispino's geography and history, portraying it as a place both devout and forgotten, a town existing on the periphery of the modern world. The convent of Santa Marta itself is not merely a building but a fortress of medieval discipline. Founded in the late 15th century by a strictly ascetic order, the convent's charter mandated extreme isolation. This section focuses heavily on the concept of inviolacy, the canonical law granting complete, protected autonomy to cloistered orders from external interference, emphasizing that the Church itself built the walls that now conceal the secret. These walls were consecrated to keep the world's sin out, but in practice, they now serve to prevent the truth from leaking out. We explore the severity of the nuns' vows, specifically their emphasis on silence of the tongue as a form of spiritual mortification, turning their later, absolute refusal to speak from an act of madness into a horrific perfection of their discipline. The architectural detail is used to amplify the mood, the thick, moss-covered stone, the high, narrow windows, and the heavy, iron-bound doors are described as physical manifestations of their separation from the world. This isolation, initially a spiritual safeguard, has now become the perfect incubator for radical action. The key internal figures are introduced. We meet the Mother Superior, a figure whose name is only referenced in official reports to maintain an eerie distance. She is not a benevolent leader but a zealot, a woman whose piety had long since curdled into a tyrannical form of administrative control, viewing the convent's strict rules not as guides to humility but as instruments of her personal authority. Her control is painted as the catalyst for the events to come. In sharp contrast, we introduce Sister Emilia, the youngest nun, whose journal fragments, the only potential breach in the silence, are crucial. Emilia arrived at the convent as a teenager, full of innocent, almost naive devotion. The voiceover provides excerpts from her journal predating the silence, depicting the early, simple beauty of her faith, the scent of polished wood, the sound of communal prayer, the comforting rhythm of the hours. This innocence serves as the emotional baseline against which the growing shadow is measured. The contrast between Emilia's early entries and the Mother Superior's cold rigidity establishes the internal tension that led to the schism. The final part of this section details the specific, meticulous ways the nuns maintained the facade during the first few weeks of the silence. They continued their assigned tasks, baking the communion hosts, tending the small herb garden, weaving linens, with an eerie, robotic precision. The absence of speech was not accompanied by any corresponding disorder. This maintenance of routine is highlighted as the most terrifying aspect, suggesting the silence was not a collapse but a profound, organized, and terrifyingly rational act of defiance. The townspeople, watching the lights turn on and off at the usual times, and receiving their usual deliveries of goods in unnerving silence, are left to wrestle with a fear far worse than the supernatural, the fear of absolute, coordinated human will turned against them. This section concludes with the psychological certainty that these women are not afflicted by an outside force, they are enacting a terrifying, internal judgment. Even in the most serene of places, small disturbances can hint at a hidden darkness, and the convent in northern Italy was no exception. For years, subtle anomalies had gone unnoticed or dismissed, accumulating like shadows in the corners of candlelit corridors. These early signs, seemingly trivial at first, would later reveal themselves as ominous indicators of a deeply buried secret. This section immerses the audience in the slow, creeping tension of a world where the ordinary and the sinister coexist, emphasizing how isolation and rigid discipline allowed unusual behaviors to flourish unnoticed. The first anomalies are minor, almost imperceptible to outsiders. Lay workers report fleeting instances of missing items, books, linens, or religious implements, disappearing only to reappear in strange places. Doors, typically locked or carefully supervised, are found ajar, yet no explanation is ever offered. Visitors occasionally notice odd smells, faint but persistent, that resemble decay or dampness, though they are dismissed as the natural aroma of an old stone building. The narrative stresses that these small irregularities, while seemingly mundane, accumulate in ways that unsettle both characters and audience. The sensory details, the creak of floorboards, the faint metallic tang in the air, the cold draft in a locked corridor, create a pervasive unease, drawing the audience into the quiet suspense of observation and suspicion. Nuns themselves begin exhibiting subtle behavioral anomalies. Some are withdrawn, avoiding communal prayers or meals, while others speak in hushed tones behind closed doors. Small signs of ritual deviation emerge, unorthodox fasting, secretive candle lighting, or whispered phrases during the night. These minor acts, invisible to outsiders and even to some members of the convent, indicate the slow psychological shift under the weight of secrecy. The narrative emphasizes the interplay between obedience, guilt, and fear, illustrating how the human mind adapts to and rationalizes concealment. The audience is made aware that the world of devotion and order within the convent is slowly fracturing beneath the surface. Neighbors, though largely respectful of the convent, begin to notice irregularities. An elderly woman recalls seeing nuns moving furtively in the moonlight, carrying bundles or heavy objects, their actions silent and hurried. A local shopkeeper mentions receiving unusual requests for supplies, items not typically used in convent routines, suggesting preparation for something unknown. These observations are framed in a way that reflects the tension between curiosity and social restraint. In a deeply religious community, questioning the convent's practices is both culturally and morally fraught. The audience experiences this hesitation vicariously, sensing the mounting unease that authority and piety can mask darker currents. The narrative also explores the psychological mechanisms at play within the convent itself. Younger nuns, newly assigned to the cloistered life, notice the discrepancies and whisper among themselves in private, but fear retribution. Some rationalize the oddities as part of rigorous spiritual exercises or discipline. The story examines this moral and cognitive dissonance, showing how fear and obedience create a fertile ground for concealment. Over time, these justifications become habitual, the abnormal slowly accepted as normal, and the audience witnesses the insidious power of long-term secrecy in shaping perception and behavior. Suspense builds through accounts of strange noises at night. Footsteps echo in empty corridors, doors creak without cause, and faint sobbing or murmuring seems to emanate from locked rooms. The narrative details these occurrences with cinematic precision, emphasizing their psychological impact, sleep deprivation, heightened anxiety, and the sense that the building itself conceals dark secrets. The audience is drawn into the auditory world of the convent, feeling the tension of unacknowledged fear and the oppressive weight of uncertainty. Religious rituals themselves begin to take on a peculiar intensity. Some nuns exhibit heightened fervor, attending prayers with an almost desperate devotion, while others subtly avoid public observance. This contrast creates an atmosphere of imbalance, where extreme piety masks underlying tension. The narrative explores the duality of outward holiness and internal struggle, emphasizing how environments structured around obedience and spiritual rigor can conceal moral compromise. These observations reinforce the audience's growing awareness that something deeply unnatural is unfolding within the cloistered walls. Small accidents and unexplained events further escalate the sense of unease. Items are knocked over, candles extinguished prematurely, or objects appear in places that defy logical explanation. Lay staff recount instances of fleeting shadows in peripheral vision or rooms that feel inexplicably cold. These moments are presented with slow-building suspense, allowing the audience to experience the uncertainty, fear, and dread that pervades the convent. The narrative stresses the tension between the seen and unseen, the natural and the supernatural, leaving the audience questioning the boundaries of perception and reality. The cumulative effect of these anomalies begins to influence interpersonal relationships. Trust erodes among the sisters as suspicion takes root. Whispered accusations and careful observation replace open communication. The story examines the psychological toll of these fractures: sleep deprivation, heightened anxiety, and moral uncertainty weigh on those involved. By focusing on both individual and collective reactions, the narrative highlights how secrecy and fear can corrode a previously harmonious community from within. The section also considers the broader social and cultural context. In a tightly knit religious community, silence and deference are valued, while questioning authority is discouraged. This environment allows unusual behaviors to persist unchallenged, providing fertile ground for secrecy. The audience gains insight into the structural and cultural mechanisms that facilitate concealment, deepening the sense of inevitability and suspense. Finally, the section builds toward the moment when these anomalies can no longer be ignored. The audience is guided through the tension of accumulated signs, subtle hints, and unspoken fears, all converging toward discovery. By the end of the section, the narrative establishes a full sense of suspense, anticipation, and foreboding. The audience understands that the seemingly minor anomalies were the first hints of a far greater horror, setting the stage for witness accounts, escalating psychological tension, and the eventual exposure of the deadly secret. The first hints of the convent's hidden darkness move from subtle anomalies to deliberate observation as a handful of witnesses begin to notice things that cannot be explained away. This section immerses the audience in the growing tension of discovery, focusing on the individuals who dare to question the apparent serenity of the cloistered life. These witnesses, both nuns and lay workers, occupy positions on the margins of authority, giving them a perspective both intimate and dangerous. Their testimonies illuminate the creeping realization that the convent's outward appearance of devotion masks something far more sinister. The narrative begins with the youngest nuns, recently assigned to the convent, who are among the first to observe irregular behavior. They notice patterns that older, long-assimilated sisters dismiss or rationalize. Lights burning long into the night, objects moving inexplicably, and whispered conversations behind locked doors suggest secrecy beyond ordinary discretion. The audience is drawn into the uncertainty experienced by these young women, their loyalty to faith conflicts with their growing unease, and their instinct to report concerns is tempered by fear of reprisal or spiritual judgment. The tension between curiosity and obedience becomes a central theme, illustrating the psychological strain of life within hierarchical, closed institutions. Lay workers provide another crucial perspective. Maintenance staff, kitchen staff, and occasional visitors notice things that appear incongruous. A cook recounts hearing muffled sounds at night, footsteps in empty corridors, and the occasional hurried passage of cloaked figures carrying concealed objects. These seemingly minor details are treated with increasing significance, as the narrative emphasizes the pattern of secrecy and deception slowly emerging. The audience is invited to reconstruct the environment through the sensory impressions of those on the periphery, enhancing immersion and suspense. The narrative then examines the moral dilemmas faced by the witnesses. Reporting concerns carries a weighty risk. Questioning authority is discouraged in a culture built on obedience and spiritual hierarchy. Some nuns struggle with guilt, believing that drawing attention to anomalies is a personal failing of faith, while others rationalize the secrecy as a necessary preservation of piety. Lay workers, meanwhile, wrestle with fear of retaliation or ostracism. This interplay of fear, loyalty, and conscience highlights the psychological complexity of those witnessing wrongdoing in an environment that prizes concealment and compliance. As the first reports accumulate, small acts of defiance and observation grow more deliberate. Witnesses begin documenting unusual activity, noting times, locations, and behaviors, attempting to make sense of what they see without alerting senior authority figures. The narrative explores the dual pressures of observation and secrecy, emphasizing the delicate balance required to remain unnoticed while gathering evidence. The audience feels the tension of clandestine vigilance, understanding that even minor missteps could provoke suspicion or punishment. Some witnesses attempt to rationalize what they observe through spiritual or mundane explanations. They attribute unusual sounds to rats, drafts, or divine trials, and anomalies in behavior to spiritual fervor or personal eccentricities. These attempts at rationalization create dramatic irony. The audience, aware of the larger secret, recognizes the danger in ignoring the accumulating evidence. The narrative emphasizes the slow revelation of truth, highlighting how fear, obedience, and denial delay discovery. The section also explores interpersonal dynamics among the witnesses themselves. Whispers circulate in hidden corners, private conversations in kitchens or dormitories reveal shared unease, and subtle gestures convey complicity or warning. Trust becomes a precious commodity, while suspicion grows among those who fear exposure. The psychological tension is magnified by the isolation inherent in cloistered life. There is no external authority to intervene, and escape from moral complicity is nearly impossible. This creates a pressure cooker environment, both psychologically and narratively, heightening the audience's sense of foreboding. The first tangible hints of ritual irregularities emerge through these observations. Witnesses describe clandestine activities, lighting candles in forbidden patterns, secret nocturnal movements, and behaviors inconsistent with official doctrine. Each revelation is layered with descriptive sensory detail, shadows cast by flickering candlelight, muffled chants echoing down empty halls, and the oppressive weight of silence interrupted by small, secretive noises. The narrative emphasizes the slow building of suspense, showing how seemingly minor deviations from routine presage the enormity of the hidden crime. The moral and spiritual implications of these discoveries weigh heavily on witnesses. Some experience acute fear, believing they have glimpsed transgression on a divine scale. Others wrestle with cognitive dissonance, torn between reverence for authority and the undeniable evidence of wrongdoing. The audience is encouraged to engage with these conflicting emotions, understanding that witnessing a hidden horror is as psychologically taxing as the act itself. The narrative emphasizes internal conflict as a mechanism for tension, offering an intimate portrayal of fear, doubt, and moral struggle. The section also examines the incremental escalation of suspicion within the convent. As witnesses compare notes privately, the scope of the secret begins to take shape. They recognize patterns, link anomalies, and begin to understand that what they observe is neither random nor trivial. This growing awareness sets the stage for more overt acts of observation, the eventual confrontation with authority, and the unraveling of long-maintained secrecy. By the end of the section, the audience is fully immersed in the psychological and moral landscape of those who first saw through the facade, feeling both the terror and the moral imperative of revelation. The narrative closes with a lingering sense of anticipation. The first witnesses have begun to see beyond appearances, but the true scope of the secret remains obscured. Their whispered warnings and cautious observations are the thin threads connecting the audience to the forthcoming exposure of the deadly truth. Suspense is heightened by the knowledge that time, fear, and institutional control will conspire to delay full discovery, creating a slow-burn tension that carries the narrative into the next section. By carefully layering sensory detail, psychological insight, and moral complexity, the section ensures that the audience is emotionally invested in both the witnesses and the unfolding horror. As the first whispers of the convent's deadly secret reach the ears of church authorities, a calculated response begins, rooted in institutional preservation and the fear of scandal. This section explores in painstaking detail how the Vatican and local clergy respond to the revelations, revealing layers of denial, suppression, and moral conflict. The narrative immerses the audience in the mechanisms of hierarchical control, showing how power, fear, and reputation intersect to prolong secrecy even when the truth threatens to emerge. The story opens with the initial reports reaching local bishops. Accounts from lay workers, junior nuns, and observant neighbors are delivered cautiously, often in fragmented and hesitant testimony. Church officials receive these reports with a mix of disbelief, skepticism, and concern for the convent's reputation. The narrative emphasizes the careful, almost ritualistic deliberation of these early responses, private meetings in dimly lit offices, whispered phone calls, and confidential memos sent between authorities. Each action is steeped in a desire to contain the situation without provoking public alarm, reflecting the Church's prioritization of institutional stability over immediate moral clarity. Denial is the first tool employed. Senior clergy insist that reports are exaggerated or misinterpreted, attributing anomalies to misunderstanding, fatigue, or the eccentricities of individual nuns. The narrative explores the psychological mechanisms underlying this denial, the human tendency to protect one's community, the fear of destabilizing faith, and the pressure to maintain appearances. Audience tension is heightened by the knowledge that the horror is real, creating dramatic irony. Every decision to downplay or dismiss the reports carries moral weight, highlighting the conflict between truth and authority. Suppression follows quickly. Orders are issued to junior clergy and staff to refrain from discussing the matter publicly. Witnesses are subtly warned against speaking out, and correspondence containing sensitive information is carefully controlled. The narrative examines how secrecy is enforced both formally, through directives and supervision, and informally, through social pressure, fear, and implied consequences. The audience is drawn into the atmosphere of control, understanding the psychological strain on those who recognize the truth but are constrained by hierarchy and obedience. The section delves into the strategies used to manage public perception. Clergy craft official statements that emphasize routine administrative oversight or minor procedural issues, intentionally minimizing the significance of the discoveries. Visitors and journalists seeking information encounter polite obfuscation, vague explanations, or outright denial. The narrative emphasizes the meticulous care taken to preserve the image of the Church and the convent, illustrating how institutional reputation can overshadow moral responsibility. This careful choreography of words and appearances amplifies tension, as the audience recognizes the deliberate masking of an ongoing moral crisis. Internal conflict within the Church hierarchy adds complexity. Some officials advocate for thorough investigation and transparency, arguing that uncovering the truth is a moral imperative. Others counter with warnings about scandal, reputational damage, and the potential erosion of faith among parishioners. The narrative examines these debates in detail, portraying the intricate balance of power, persuasion, and fear. The audience is invited to consider the ethical dilemmas faced by those who wield authority, how to act when moral responsibility conflicts with institutional preservation, and the human cost of prioritizing image over truth. Psychological pressure on witnesses intensifies under the Church's suppression. Junior nuns, lay staff, and even some senior members experience fear, confusion, and moral anguish. They are instructed to maintain silence, often without clear explanation, creating a sense of isolation and vulnerability. The narrative delves into the mental and emotional toll of enforced secrecy, anxiety, sleepless nights, suspicion of colleagues, and the gnawing knowledge that complicity in silence is morally fraught. The audience is made to feel the suffocating atmosphere of control, heightening the story's slow-burning tension. The narrative also explores the mechanisms of bureaucratic oversight used to maintain suppression. Memos, private reports, and confidential visits create a lattice of observation designed to monitor compliance without drawing attention. Meetings in shadowed offices and whispered instructions in dim corridors illustrate how hierarchical structures enforce both obedience and concealment. Each action taken to maintain secrecy reinforces the theme of institutional complicity, demonstrating how systemic pressures can perpetuate wrongdoing long after it has begun. Subtle acts of resistance begin to appear despite the Church's efforts. Some witnesses continue to observe and document unusual activity, while others quietly question the morality of enforced silence. These acts are portrayed with psychological nuance. Fear, courage, and moral obligation intersect, highlighting the tension between individual conscience and institutional authority. The narrative emphasizes that even in environments designed to enforce control, human curiosity and morality find ways to persist, foreshadowing eventual exposure. As the section progresses, the audience witnesses the psychological and moral corrosion resulting from prolonged denial and suppression. Individuals internalize the conflict, experiencing guilt, fear, and cognitive dissonance. The convent, once a place of sanctuary, becomes a theater of quiet terror, where the weight of hidden knowledge oppresses both observers and perpetrators alike. Suspense is heightened through detailed exploration of interpersonal interactions, whispered warnings, furtive glances, and private confrontations that reveal growing tension and the inevitability of revelation. The section concludes by framing denial and suppression as both a protective and destructive force. While these measures temporarily shield the institution from scandal, they also amplify the moral decay and psychological strain within the convent. The audience is left with a chilling understanding of how hierarchical authority, fear, and devotion can conspire to conceal darkness, setting the stage for further escalation, psychological unraveling, and the eventual collapse of secrecy. By combining intricate social dynamics, emotional depth, and atmospheric tension, this section ensures that the audience is fully immersed in the complex mechanisms that allowed the deadly secret to persist. As the hidden secret within the convent festers, the psychological weight of concealment begins to exact a profound toll on everyone involved. This section delves into the emotional, mental, and spiritual unraveling experienced by both the nuns who participated in hiding the deadly secret and those who silently observed. The narrative immerses the audience in the slow, suffocating build of paranoia, fear, and moral conflict, emphasizing how long-term secrecy can distort perception, relationships, and reality itself. The story begins by tracing the immediate psychological reactions of the 12 nuns directly involved. Initially, their behavior is marked by careful control, rigid routines, and attempts to maintain normalcy. Yet beneath the surface, subtle signs of stress emerge, jittery movements, sudden outbursts of anger, whispered arguments in hidden corners, and moments of isolated despair during prayer. The narrative explores these behaviors in detail, highlighting the interplay between devotion, fear, and guilt. The audience is drawn into the claustrophobic mental world of the convent, where obedience and secrecy collide to create a pressure cooker of psychological tension. Anxiety manifests in predictable and unpredictable ways. Some nuns become hypervigilant, checking doors repeatedly, monitoring each other, and scrutinizing the behavior of lay staff or newer sisters for signs of suspicion. Others retreat inward, avoiding communal activities and spending hours in solitary prayer, which only deepens their sense of isolation. The narrative emphasizes the paradox of cloistered life. The very environment designed to cultivate serenity and spiritual focus becomes a breeding ground for fear, hyperawareness, and mental instability. Through detailed observation of these behaviors, the audience gains insight into the psychological mechanisms of long-term concealment. Paranoia spreads beyond the nuns directly involved. Lay workers and junior nuns, aware that something is amiss but lacking full knowledge, begin to fear being implicated. Subtle social cues, averted gazes, half-finished conversations, hesitant instructions, fuel growing suspicion. The narrative examines the contagion of fear, how secrecy and guilt propagate unease throughout a community, transforming everyday interactions into exercises in caution and strategy. The audience experiences the oppressive tension as the convent itself becomes a psychological trap, where every hallway, door, and ritual carries hidden significance. Sleep deprivation and emotional strain further exacerbate the psychological impact. Many of the nuns find themselves unable to rest, haunted by memories, imagined accusations, or the fear of discovery. Dreams become nightmares, blending past transgressions with imagined threats, blurring the boundary between reality and perception. The narrative portrays these mental states with cinematic clarity: sleepless vigils, the creaking of floors in the dead of night, and the oppressive stillness of empty rooms intensify the sense of entrapment. The audience is invited to experience the suffocating toll of guilt and fear as it accumulates over years of concealment. Interpersonal relationships within the convent begin to fracture under this strain. Alliances form and dissolve based on trust, suspicion, or perceived loyalty. Whispered accusations circulate, some grounded in fact, others in fear and imagination. The narrative details the psychological interplay between obedience and rebellion, devotion and resentment. The tension escalates as nuns struggle to maintain authority over one another while navigating their own moral compromise. These interactions are portrayed with meticulous attention to emotional nuance, revealing how secrecy erodes both trust and cohesion over time. The story also examines the coping mechanisms employed by the nuns. Some turn to extreme religious rituals, fasting, or prolonged prayer as a way to assuage guilt. Others engage in subtle forms of denial, convincing themselves that concealment is justified, necessary, or divinely sanctioned. The narrative explores these mechanisms with psychological depth, emphasizing that rationalization, spiritual intensity, and moral flexibility become intertwined as survival strategies. The audience witnesses how devotion and deception intertwine, highlighting the moral ambiguity and psychological complexity of the characters. Fear of discovery permeates every aspect of life within the convent. Even routine tasks, preparing meals, cleaning, or attending prayer, become acts fraught with tension. Small mistakes, missteps, or unintended revelations carry the potential for exposure. The narrative amplifies suspense through detailed accounts of these everyday pressures, the careful placement of objects, the silent communication between nuns, and the constant, almost imperceptible monitoring of one another. The audience senses the claustrophobic intensity of a life lived in perpetual vigilance, where nothing is truly private and trust is continually tested. The psychological toll is not limited to fear and paranoia, it manifests as guilt, shame, and spiritual crisis. Nuns wrestle with the contradiction between their vows of piety and their complicity in concealment. Confessions, private prayers, and moments of silent lament illustrate the depth of inner conflict. The narrative emphasizes that moral and spiritual dissonance can be as damaging as external threat, shaping behavior, perception, and relationships in subtle yet profound ways. The audience is invited to contemplate the human cost of secrecy and the fragility of moral judgment under extreme pressure. Finally, the section explores the cumulative effect of these psychological pressures on the convent as a whole. The once orderly institution begins to show cracks, routines falter, rituals lose their solemnity, and the atmosphere is thick with tension and distrust. The narrative portrays the convent as a microcosm of moral and psychological decay, where fear, secrecy, and obedience have created an environment in which the human mind is both protector and prisoner of hidden transgressions. The audience is left with a chilling understanding that the escalation of psychological toll is inevitable, setting the stage for eventual confrontation, exposure, and the unraveling of long-suppressed secrets. The culmination of Marco's painstaking work in the last section leads directly into the devastating revelation contained within the final, intact section of Sister Amelia's clay journal. This section serves as the narrative's emotional climax, finally revealing the mortal secret that necessitated the 5 years of profound, terrifying silence. The discovery is not merely about financial corruption, as earlier entries hinted, but a deadly, moral failing involving the deliberate neglect of a vulnerable life. The narrative reveals, through Amelia's chilling, frantic script, the story of a young orphan girl, named only as Chiara, meaning clear or light, who had been secretly placed in the convent's care. Chiara represented the convent's most sacred trust, the pure, undefended innocence that their vows were meant to protect. Amelia reveals that the Mother Superior, viewing the girl as a logistical complication to her administrative control and financial maneuvers, had systematically denied her necessary medical care and sustenance. The girl's death, several months before the silence began, was not an accident but an act of deliberate, mortal neglect, a crime cloaked in the sanctity of the cloister. Amelia's final entries detail the agonizing realization among the 12 younger nuns that their obedience was now complicity in murder. The silence, therefore, was transformed from a protest against corruption into a collective vow of non-sanction, a resolution to never again use the language that could be corrupted by the Mother Superior or the institutional hierarchy to justify the crime. Their silence was a chosen, public condemnation, a sustained, agonizing performance of witness. The tension intensifies as the journal describes the Mother Superior's reaction to the leaking of the secret. She is portrayed as having slowly, terrifyingly realized that her most pious nun, Amelia, was the conduit of the truth. The climax details the final night, Amelia writing frantically, realizing the danger. The script describes the sudden, profound silence in the corridors being broken by a sound other than the rhythmic scraping, the sound of a heavy door being slowly unlocked, followed by the soft, measured footsteps of the Mother Superior. The final, physical confrontation is narrated through the horrifying lens of the journal entry itself. The last lines of the clay script are fractured, detailing the Mother Superior's calm, terrifying demeanor as she confronts Amelia, not with anger, but with a chilling, self-righteous pity. The Mother Superior views Amelia's truth-telling as the ultimate betrayal of the order's isolation. The section reaches its emotional peak with Amelia's final, barely legible words, an accusation that is then abruptly smeared, suggesting a violent, immediate cessation of the writing. The scene cuts back to the present day, the discovery, hours later, of the Mother Superior's empty, meticulously prepared chamber. Her habit is neatly folded on the foot of the bed, her cell scrubbed clean. Most chillingly, however, Sister Amelia is also gone. All that remains is the final, blood-splattered journal fragment found near the convent's main gate, suggesting a struggle and a vanishing point. The physical evidence confirms the horrific act and the confrontation, but the vanishing of the two principal figures transforms the mystery from a historical scandal into a true macabre puzzle, leaving only the 11 remaining, perfectly silent nuns behind. The disappearance of the Mother Superior and Sister Amelia, coupled with the final, damning evidence contained within the clay journal fragments, finally shatters the institutional silence imposed by Bishop Malatesta 5 years prior. The local, contained mystery transforms into a high-stakes ecclesiastical scandal that can no longer be ignored or dismissed as simple melancholia. The fragmented report, now carrying the weight of a proven mortal crime and the potential political embarrassment of a long-term cover-up, bypasses the diocesan level and reaches the highest chambers of the Vatican's Holy Office. The reaction is swift, brutal, and utterly devoid of spiritual subtlety. A special, non-religious commission of inquiry, internally nicknamed the Iron Fist, is dispatched to Crispino. This commission is led by Cardinal Valenti, a figure introduced as the antithesis of Father Tommaso and Bishop Malatesta. Valenti is not a man of simple faith or political expediency, but a ruthless, highly intelligent canon lawyer and political operative whose sole concern is the rigorous preservation of the Church's judicial authority and institutional stability. For Valenti, the mystery is not a spiritual drama, but a crime scene and a legal liability. Valenti's investigation is detailed as a methodical, chilling demolition of the convent's centuries-old protection. He ignores the spiritual context entirely, treating the convent as an institution that has violated civil and moral law. The core focus of his inquiry is twofold: the crime, the death of the orphan, Chiara, and the conspiracy, the collective silence and cover-up. He immediately dismisses the nuns' silence as irrelevant. Unlike the local priests, Valenti does not attempt to plead, command, or cajole them into speaking. He treats the 11 remaining nuns not as pious women under a vow, but as witnesses refusing to cooperate in a criminal investigation. He uses a calculated, legalistic approach, separating the 11 women and subjecting them to relentless, purely secular questioning focused only on dates, movements, and financial documents, effectively bypassing their religious vow of silence through sheer, procedural force. Under Valenti's ruthless examination, the full extent of the Mother Superior's corruption is laid bare. He uncovers not only the mortal neglect of the orphan but also a complex web of financial fraud involving the convent's endowments and land sales, the cover-up of which was the original, driving force behind her tyrannical control. The contrast framing here is powerful. The slow, agonizing, emotional build-up of the mystery is abruptly replaced by the cold, efficient, and legalistic mechanism of institutional power, which tears apart the fragile moral construct the nuns had built. The section culminates in the final, dramatic act, the forced physical removal of the 11 remaining nuns. Valenti issues a decree of suppression for the convent of Santa Marta. The nuns are led out by armed guards and church officials, stripped of their protective vows and their sanctuary. Yet, even in this moment of institutional collapse, the 11 women maintain their perfect, terrifying silence. As they are loaded onto carriages for transport to distant, often secularized, institutions, their unwavering refusal to speak is interpreted by Valenti not as piety, but as final, organized defiance. Their absolute silence forces the church hierarchy to take the most drastic public measure possible, the permanent closure and deconsecration of a holy site, thereby officially validating the seriousness of the secret the women had been guarding, even without uttering a single word. This intervention marks the end of the convent's life and the beginning of the painful, institutional aftermath. The physical dismantling of the convent of Santa Marta and the removal of the 11 silent nuns initiates the phase of closure, yet the true resolution of the deadly secret remains elusive until the fate of the 2 missing women is determined. This section focuses on the 2 parallel events that finally break the spell of the 5-year silence, the discovery and confession of the Mother Superior, and the silent, profound act of the dispersed nuns. The Mother Superior, having vanished during the night of Emilia's final entry, is found several miles from Crespino, hiding in a remote, half-collapsed grotto known locally as the Lamenting Cave. She is discovered by a shepherd weeks after her disappearance, found in a state of profound delirium and near death from exposure and starvation. She is immediately taken into custody by Cardinal Valenti's commission for both medical care and interrogation. Her confession, extracted in fragmented, fevered whispers during her final days, is detailed via the narrator's voiceover. It is a psychologically complex breakdown. She does not confess to murder, but to justification. She admits to the financial malfeasance and the deliberate neglect of the orphan Chiara, but frames her actions as a necessary, painful sacrifice to preserve the purity of the institution from the profane pressures of the external world. She views the nuns' silence not as a moral protest, but as a demonic curse that afflicted the convent after she was forced to commit her necessary sin. Her final words are a desperate, self-deceptive justification of her tyranny, maintaining her righteousness to the very end. Her death shortly after her fragmented confession provides a grim closure to the crime, but the institutional lie is maintained by her framing of the event as an act of spiritual warfare, not human malice. Meanwhile, the 11 remaining silent nuns are subjected to their own resolution. They are dispersed across Italy to various, secularized nursing homes and hospitals, removed from the protection of their cloistered vows, their isolation broken. They are officially treated as patients suffering from chronic mental alienation. Over the ensuing decades, they live out their lives in a state of perfect, unwavering silence. Their quiet perseverance becomes their enduring protest. The narrative focuses on the fate of one of the 11, an unnamed nun referred to only as Sister L, who lives for over 40 years in a state of absolute, tranquil muteness. Her life in the secular hospital is described. She never responds to a question, never communicates a need, yet meticulously performs the small, personal duties of her day. This sustained performance of silence is, in its own right, a colossal act of human endurance. The section reaches its emotional crescendo on Sister L's deathbed, decades after the convent's suppression. Attended by a young, secular nurse, who knows the woman only as a silent eccentric, Sister L is given last rites, though she is technically no longer under vows. As her life ebbs, the nurse leans close, and in her final moment of expiration, Sister L performs the only known, recorded act of breaking the silence. She whispers a single, cryptic word into the nurse's ear, a word that is transcribed in the hospital log, but whose precise meaning is ambiguous. The word is not Chiara's name, nor is it confession, but a term that hints at collective sorrow and profound self-blame, a word that simultaneously confirms the horrific act and suggests a terrible, shared forgiveness they had vowed never to receive. This single spoken word, decades later, acts as the ultimate, chilling legacy of the pact, confirming the truth while adding a final layer of profound ambiguity to the women's suffering. The resolution of the Mother Superior's confession and the single, dying word of Sister L failed to provide the clean, definitive closure the Vatican craved or the public demanded. This final section pulls back to examine the aftermath of the scandal, focusing on the unresolved questions and the enduring macabre legacy of the silent nuns, ensuring the narrative ends with a profound sense of lingering unease. The first major unresolved question centers on Sister Amelia, the messenger of the truth. Her disappearance, alongside the Mother Superior, was never fully explained. Cardinal Valenti's official report concluded she was likely murdered by the Mother Superior and her body disposed of somewhere within the vast, overgrown convent grounds or the surrounding hills. Yet, no body was ever found. The narrative revisits this point, suggesting the alternative, that Amelia, having successfully ensured the secret's escape, chose to disappear into the secular world, a radical act of self-exile and personal survival, refusing to be institutionalized by either the Church or the state. This ambiguity leaves the audience with the hope, however slim, that the one nun who spoke out with her hands achieved true freedom, or the chilling alternative that she was the final, unrecovered victim. Next, the fate of the convent of Santa Marta itself is chronicled. Following its suppression, it was thoroughly stripped of its religious artifacts and deconsecrated. It was eventually sold to a secular developer from Milan who planned to convert the ancient structure into a luxury retreat. However, 2 years into the planned renovation, the entire east wing, the section adjacent to where the scraping sounds and the unidentified incense had originated, was engulfed in a massive, inexplicable fire during a fierce summer storm. The destruction was total, and the developer abandoned the project. The final footage of the convent is of its burnt, skeletal ruins, a physical testament to the lingering moral toxicity of the place. The narration suggests that the sacred stones themselves refused to house corruption or commerce, choosing oblivion instead. The section then delves into the profound, philosophical tension that underlies the entire event. Was the silence an act of divine inspiration, a miracle of conscience designed to expose corruption? Was it a radical moral protest, a purely human, perfectly organized political maneuver by women stripped of all other power? Or was it, as Dr. Rossi eventually conceded, a terrifying form of shared psychosis born of the unbearable isolation and the trauma of witnessing a mortal crime? The inability to definitively categorize the silence is what preserves its mystery. Finally, the narrative returns to the macro level, the Vatican's role. The scandal forced minor, yet significant, reforms in the governance of isolated convents, primarily centered on external oversight of financial endowments. Yet, the lasting legacy is the institutional preference for suppression over truth. The Vatican successfully contained the story, ensuring it remained an obscure footnote filed away in the archives. The chilling conclusion posits that the 12 nuns achieved their protest not by speaking, but by forcing the powerful institution to undertake the most dramatic, public act possible, the destruction of a centuries-old convent, to acknowledge a deadly secret that had been concealed not by words, but by 5 years of unblinking, unyielding silence. The closing shot lingers on the dust motes over the sealed, leather-bound file in the Vatican archives, its institutional silence now perfectly mirroring the profound, terrifying human silence it contains. The revelation of the nuns' secret reverberates across the local community, the wider church, and the international stage, leaving a complex tapestry of shock, disbelief, and moral reckoning. The convent, once a hub of spiritual life and devotion, is now enveloped in a hushed tension, its corridors echoing with absence and suspicion. This section opens with the immediate aftermath of the scandal: clergy, lay workers, and townspeople struggling to process the unimaginable. The narrative emphasizes the quiet despair and fractured trust within the community, illustrating how a single, long-hidden secret can destabilize entire social and religious networks. Families of the nuns are caught between pride, grief, and shame. Interviews and recollections reveal the internal conflict experienced by those who had previously viewed the convent as a sanctuary of virtue. Parents and siblings recall moments of kindness and devotion, juxtaposed against the revelation that their loved ones were complicit in concealing death and deception. These personal narratives serve to humanize the nuns, showing them as both victims and participants in a moral collapse. The audience is drawn into the emotional complexity of reconciliation, guilt, and familial loyalty. Local townspeople respond with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The convent, which had long been a respected institution, is now scrutinized under a lens of suspicion. Daily interactions are colored by whispered conversations and veiled glances, creating a palpable atmosphere of tension. The narrative explores the societal dynamics that emerge in the wake of scandal, fear of association, the policing of morality, and the struggle to rebuild trust within a fractured community. The interplay between public perception and private knowledge deepens the psychological drama. The Vatican's response is methodical yet controversial. Internal investigations reveal the layers of bureaucratic deliberation and the tension between transparency and institutional preservation. Some officials advocate for strict disciplinary measures, while others prioritize protecting the Church's image and minimizing public scandal. The narrative examines this delicate balancing act, highlighting the moral and ethical dilemmas faced by religious authorities. The audience gains insight into the complexity of accountability in hierarchical institutions, where moral clarity often conflicts with strategic preservation. Legal proceedings follow, though they are constrained by the unique position of religious institutions within the Italian legal framework. Canonical law, civil oversight, and the interplay between local and Vatican authorities create a labyrinthine process that is both frustrating and illuminating. The story details the investigation steps, interviews, confessions, and forensic examinations. Witnesses recount their experiences of intimidation, persuasion, and fear, illustrating the difficulty of uncovering truth in environments built on obedience and secrecy. The narrative highlights the procedural challenges and the emotional toll on everyone involved. The psychological and emotional fallout among the nuns themselves is explored in depth. Some express profound remorse, grappling with the moral implications of years of concealment. Others rationalize their actions, citing obedience, fear, or doctrinal justification. The narrative examines the cognitive dissonance experienced by those who must reconcile spiritual devotion with moral failure, portraying a nuanced spectrum of human response under extreme social and religious pressure. This section emphasizes the long-term effects of guilt, secrecy, and moral compromise on individual identity and mental health. Media coverage amplifies the scandal, exposing the story to national and international audiences. Journalists reconstruct timelines, interview witnesses, and analyze the Church's response, turning a secluded convent into a symbol of institutional failure. The narrative explores the interplay between media attention and public perception, showing how storytelling shapes collective memory and moral judgment. Sensational headlines contrast with careful investigative reporting, creating a tension between outrage and understanding that mirrors the audience's emotional journey. Community initiatives arise in the wake of the scandal, as parishioners, mental health professionals, and civic organizations attempt to address the emotional and spiritual trauma left in its wake. Counseling sessions, public forums, and academic analyses seek to make sense of what occurred, while some locals attempt to restore normalcy through ritual and tradition. The narrative emphasizes the slow and often uneven process of societal healing, highlighting both the resilience and fragility of communities affected by long-hidden transgressions. Religious scholars weigh in, analyzing the scandal through historical, theological, and psychological lenses. The narrative delves into comparisons with other historical cases of clerical secrecy and moral failings, exploring patterns of obedience, fear, and institutional self-preservation. These analyses provide broader context, situating the convent's events within a continuum of human behavior under hierarchical authority. The audience is encouraged to consider the interplay between individual morality and systemic pressures, deepening the philosophical resonance of the story. The section concludes by reflecting on the lingering ambiguity and unresolved consequences of the scandal. Some questions remain unanswered: the motivations of certain individuals, the extent of knowledge among church officials, and the potential for similar secrecy elsewhere. The convent itself becomes a symbol of moral and spiritual complexity, an enduring reminder of how easily virtue and darkness can coexist in hidden spaces. The narrative closes with an evocative meditation on accountability, secrecy, and the human capacity for both devotion and deception, leaving the audience with a haunting sense of reflection and moral unease. The aftermath of the scandal extends far beyond the convent walls, infiltrating both the local community and the broader perception of religious authority. Scholars and journalists alike probe the details, attempting to reconcile the unimaginable with the realities of human behavior. The section opens by revisiting the convent itself, now silent and partially abandoned. Once a bustling center of devotion and ritual, it is now marked by shadows, locked doors, and corridors that echo with absence. The air carries the memory of whispered secrets and hidden transgressions, and the physical decay mirrors the moral and psychological collapse that occurred within. Families of the nuns struggle to process the duality of devotion and guilt. They recount memories of sisters who were loving, compassionate, and seemingly pious, contrasting with the revelation of their hidden complicity in concealing a deadly secret. Local townspeople, too, wrestle with conflicting emotions, reverence for the religious institution and revulsion at its concealment. This tension highlights the psychological complexity of communities shaped by faith, obedience, and fear of scandal. The narrative delves into individual testimonies, exploring the quiet despair, confusion, and lingering mistrust that now permeates daily life. The Vatican's internal inquiries are meticulously examined, revealing the layered bureaucratic machinery designed to protect reputation, even in the face of moral catastrophe. Officials discuss the difficulty of addressing both the legal and spiritual dimensions of the scandal. The narrative explores the delicate balance between punishment, absolution, and institutional preservation, emphasizing the tension between justice and the preservation of faith. Analysts debate whether the nuns' actions were the product of extreme psychological conditioning, systemic pressure, or intentional malice, creating a nuanced portrait of human behavior under rigid authority. Journalistic investigations reveal fragments of previously undisclosed information, letters, diaries, and confessions that shed light on the psychological and emotional states of those involved. Some nuns express remorse, others justify their actions through obedience or fear. The section interweaves these narratives to explore how secrets are rationalized, normalized, and maintained over years. Subtle signs of dissent, small acts of rebellion, and unheeded warnings underscore the fragility of morality under extreme social and religious pressure. The scandal ignites broader discussions about religious institutions, secrecy, and the human capacity for concealment. Experts on psychology and theology weigh in, analyzing the long-term effects on both the individuals and the institution itself. The narrative emphasizes the contrasts between outward devotion and hidden darkness, rational thought and ritualized obedience, faith and moral compromise. Through detailed exploration of these tensions, the story illustrates how environments that prioritize conformity and secrecy can incubate tragedy over time. Cultural repercussions are also examined. Public discourse in media, forums, and academic circles debates responsibility, oversight, and the role of faith in regulating human behavior. The narrative explores the uneasy intersection of morality, law, and spiritual authority, revealing how scandal forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about institutions once regarded as beyond reproach. Interviews, archival footage, and reconstructed dialogues immerse the audience in the continued ripple effects of the hidden horror. The section gradually shifts focus to the nuns themselves, tracing their lives after exposure. Some remain within the church, reassigned under strict supervision, attempting to reconcile faith and guilt. Others leave entirely, struggling to rebuild identities fractured by years of concealment and moral compromise. Personal accounts illuminate the long-term psychological consequences: anxiety, depression, PTSD, and complex feelings of shame and relief. The narrative portrays the slow process of psychological recovery, marked by small victories, lingering shadows, and persistent questions about morality and agency. The convent's physical space remains a symbol of secrecy and lost innocence. Descriptions of empty halls, locked chambers, and decaying objects serve as a meditation on impermanence and the weight of history. The audience is encouraged to visualize the lingering echoes of ritual and secrecy, understanding the power of space to retain memory and trauma. This imagery reinforces the thematic tension between appearance and reality, devotion and deception. Finally, the story broadens to consider the universal implications of the scandal. Philosophical reflections explore human tendencies toward obedience, fear, and concealment in hierarchical structures. The narrative connects the convent's tragedy to broader historical and cultural patterns, showing how environments of isolation, strict hierarchy, and moral absolutism can incubate dark secrets. The conclusion emphasizes lingering ambiguity: not all questions are answered, not all culpability can be measured, and some shadows remain beyond illumination. The audience is left with a chilling meditation on secrecy, faith, and the fragile boundaries of human morality. In the years following the revelation of the convent's long-buried secret, the story refuses to fade. Instead, it transforms, shifting from scandal to legend, from whispered memory to a haunting legacy that stretches far beyond the walls of the once silent sanctuary. This section explores the shadow that lingers over the town, the church, and the generations that follow, showing how certain truths never settle, they echo, reshape, and transform entire eras of belief. The convent itself becomes a monument to contradiction. For decades it stood as a fortress of devotion, a symbolic refuge for those seeking spiritual purity. Now, despite repairs, renovations, and administrative reshuffling, the air around it seems to pulse with unhealed tension. Pilgrims, tourists, and investigators wander the grounds, their footsteps breaking the stillness that once governed these halls. The narrative paints vivid scenes of visitors tracing the outlines of stone walls, peering into shadowed corners, and wondering how a holy refuge transformed into a silent repository of fear and moral collapse. Even those who never knew the nuns feel the weight of the place's history pressing quietly against their senses, leaving them unsettled without fully understanding why. The townspeople, once eager to move on, gradually accept that the scandal has become part of their cultural identity. Instead of vanishing into obscurity, the story grows, intertwined with local folklore. Older residents recall the days when rumors first began, while younger generations are raised on muted warnings and half-formed lessons about obedience, secrecy, and the fragile boundary between faith and fear. The narrative details ordinary household conversations, schoolyard retellings, and community gatherings where the scandal resurfaces in small but persistent ways. The town learns, over time, that some histories demand acknowledgement, not erasure. Academics, historians, and theologians continue to analyze the events, framing them within larger questions about institutional authority and moral psychology. Conferences are held, papers published, and debates staged in universities across Europe and beyond. Some argue that the nuns acted out of fear and coercion, shaped by a system that prioritized image over accountability. Others insist that individual agency cannot be overshadowed by institutional critique. The narrative follows these intellectual ripples, illustrating how the scandal becomes a reference point in discussions about obedience, autonomy, and the pressure exerted by hierarchical belief systems. The convent's tragedy becomes a case study, not merely a footnote. Meanwhile, the Vatican's memory of the event evolves. Official documents remain sparse, reflecting a delicate balance between acknowledgement and discretion. Internal reports are preserved in restricted archives, accessible only to select researchers. Some church officials quietly reference the scandal in discussions about reform, insisting that transparency must be prioritized to prevent similar moral fractures. Others avoid invoking it altogether, preferring to leave it buried in whispered recollection. Through this tension, the narrative exposes the institutional struggle between preservation and transformation, showing how the weight of past failures can shape the future of faith. Families connected to the 12 nuns carry their own complicated legacy. Some choose to confront it openly, sharing journals, letters, and memories of their relatives with historians or filmmakers. Others retreat into protective silence, refusing to let the public define their loved ones solely by the scandal. The narrative explores these deeply personal responses: the mother who keeps her daughter's rosary locked away because it reminds her of both devotion and deception, the brother who travels annually to the convent grounds for reasons he cannot articulate, the niece who becomes a scholar specializing in religious psychology after discovering an old photograph of her aunt. These intimate stories add layers of emotional complexity to the broader legacy, demonstrating how personal and collective history intersect. Over time, the convent becomes a focal point for spiritual seekers and skeptics alike. Some visitors feel drawn to its troubled past, interpreting it as a symbol of the human struggle to reconcile faith with imperfection. Others approach it with caution, sensing that the stones themselves carry echoes of unresolved suffering. The narrative describes late-evening vigils, candlelit walks, and quiet prayers whispered by those who visit hoping to find peace, answers, or closure. In these moments, the legacy of the convent transforms into something multifaceted, neither wholly sacred nor entirely profane. The scandal also sparks broader cultural reflections. Filmmakers, novelists, and artists reinterpret the story from different angles, blending historical record with imaginative reconstruction. Their works, while sometimes controversial, keep the memory alive. The narrative describes how a documentary series renews public interest in the scandal, prompting fresh investigations into events long settled. Through such cultural echoes, the story endures, reshaping itself according to the concerns and questions of each new generation. Yet despite the attention, many questions remain unanswered. Motives, decisions, and moments of crisis are lost to time, memory, and guarded silence. The remains of diaries, recorded confessions, and fragmented testimonies offer clues but not clarity. The narrative explores the haunting persistence of mystery, the sense that beneath each answer lies a deeper, more complicated truth. The audience is reminded that human actions often defy simple explanations and that some events retain their power precisely because they resist definitive interpretation. In the final reflection, the convent stands not as a relic of corruption alone but as a testament to the complexity of human morality. The narrative draws the audience into a meditation on the nature of secrecy, guilt, and redemption. It emphasizes that the legacy of the nuns' hidden act is not merely one of condemnation but of confronting the fragile balance between devotion and fear, righteousness and error. The story lingers like a shadow just out of reach, impossible to grasp fully, yet impossible to forget. Through this unresolved quiet, the legacy lives on, shaping both memory and conscience long after the final confession has faded into silence. Long after the scandal has settled into the folds of local history, long after the Vatican investigations have closed their final pages, long after the convent's doors have been repainted and its gardens trimmed into quiet order, there remains an echo, soft, persistent, and strangely alive. This echo is not confined to walls or memories, it moves through generations, shaping perceptions, beliefs, and the uneasy silence that follows the mere mention of what happened inside that religious sanctuary. This section explores that lingering reverberation, examining how certain truths do not decay with time but instead deepen, twist, and transform into something more powerful than the events themselves. In the decades that follow, the convent becomes a place defined by contradiction. On official maps, it is simply a historical building with a note explaining that it once housed a small community of devout women. In tourist guides, it is referenced cautiously, described as a site of complex spiritual heritage. Yet in the minds of locals, the convent remains something more potent, a symbol of a lesson that was never fully learned, a reminder of the fragile line between sacred duty and human error. Children grow up hearing bits and pieces, warnings disguised as bedtime stories, lessons whispered by their elders about the dangers of silence and unexamined obedience. The narrative highlights these small cultural transmissions, showing how communities preserve memory through fragments rather than full histories. For many, the scandal becomes a way to question broader societal structures. Scholars begin to examine how the mechanisms of secrecy, authority, and obedience extend far beyond religious institutions. Conferences are held where the convent's case is used as a model for discussing the psychology of group decision-making, the ethics of hierarchical power, and the delicate relationship between personal responsibility and collective identity. Young researchers, drawn by the combination of mystery and historical relevance, travel to the town to access archives, interview remaining witnesses, or simply observe the lingering atmosphere. Their presence becomes part of the town's evolving identity, an acknowledgement that the past remains alive because people continue to seek answers. The Vatican handles the legacy of the scandal with careful restraint. Official statements remain minimal, referencing the event only in abstract terms, if at all. Yet internal reforms trace subtle origins back to the lessons learned from the convent. Training programs for clergy include new modules on transparency, moral courage, and the psychological risks of isolated religious communities. Some officials quietly advocate for greater accountability across all church institutions, believing that the failure to confront the scandal openly allowed its moral weight to grow into something more haunting. The narrative portrays these internal shifts with nuance, showing how institutions evolve slowly, often influenced more by unspoken lessons than by explicit acknowledgement. The families connected to the 12 nuns develop their own complex relationship with the legacy. Some embrace silence as a form of protection, refusing to participate in interviews or public discussions, believing that reopening the story dishonors the memory of their relatives. Others pursue the truth with determination, attempting to reconstruct the events that were obscured by secrecy and fear. The narrative follows several hypothetical descendants, a granddaughter who becomes a journalist, a nephew who joins the church and struggles with the shadow cast by his family's history, a sister who keeps all surviving letters in a locked drawer, each representing a different way of engaging with a shared and painful legacy. Their stories provide emotional depth to the broader historical narrative, reminding the audience that the consequences of secrecy do not end with a single generation. Visitors continue to come to the convent, though many cannot articulate what draws them. Some arrive seeking closure, others curiosity, and others a strange mixture of fascination and discomfort. Guided tours occasionally touch on the scandal, but always in measured terms, emphasizing the complexity of the situation. The narrative describes these visits with atmospheric detail: the stillness of the courtyard at dusk, the coolness of the chapel stones beneath wandering fingers, the sound of a guide speaking softly as if afraid to disturb something sleeping. Even without dramatization, these sensory moments suggest an undercurrent of unfinished business, a sense that the convent retains a memory of its former inhabitants' struggles. The convent's transformation into a heritage site becomes both a tribute and a burden. On one hand, preserving the building ensures that its history, however uncomfortable, will not be erased. On the other hand, the act of preservation forces the community to continually confront the events associated with it. Restoration teams encounter hidden chambers, sealed cupboards, and forgotten objects that trace the daily lives of the nuns, sparking new speculations and reopening old wounds. Each discovery becomes an opportunity for reflection: what stories remain untold, what motivations remain unclear, what truths were buried with the women who once lived here. The narrative uses these physical remnants as metaphors for the emotional and moral remnants that persist within the community. Legends begin to form around the convent. Some claim that the building holds an eerie stillness at night, as if the past were suspended in its walls. Others insist that nothing supernatural exists, only the weight of collective memory. These stories evolve not as sensational tales but as cultural expressions of unresolved tension. The narrative explores how communities transform trauma into folklore, using symbolic stories to give shape to emotions that resist direct articulation. Whether villagers speak of ghostly footsteps or simply of heavy silence, the result is the same: an acknowledgement that the past remains alive in some intangible form. As time moves forward, the scandal becomes a point of departure for broader discussions about morality, vulnerability, and the human ability to justify wrongdoing under pressure. Philosophers reference the case in essays about ethical collapse, while psychologists analyze how isolation and fear can distort judgment. The narrative traces these intellectual developments, showing how the events of a single convent reverberate outward into disciplines far removed from its walls. The scandal shifts from being a story of wrongdoing to being a lens through which to understand the complexities of human behavior. Its legacy becomes both cautionary and instructive. Yet for all the analysis, debate, and reflection, a central truth remains: some stories refuse to conclude neatly. The convent's history persists because it speaks to something universal: a human tendency to turn away from uncomfortable truths, a fear of confronting our own moral vulnerabilities, a longing for certainty in a world that offers none. The narrative concludes by emphasizing that the legacy of the scandal is not merely about what happened, but about the echoes it left behind, in scholarly debates, in family histories, in cultural memory, and in the quiet spaces of the convent itself. These echoes refuse to die because they resonate with questions that every generation must face. The final image is one of enduring ambiguity. The convent stands in the fading light, its windows reflecting the last color of the day. Inside, the rooms are quiet, the air still. Yet the silence feels full, a silence shaped not by absence but by memory. The echo lingers, not loud enough to be heard, but powerful enough to be felt. And in that subtle reverberation, the story of the 12 nuns continues, not as a closed chapter but as a living reminder of the delicate balance between faith and fear, truth and concealment, human weakness and the longing for absolution.